They didn't fall out of love. They just waited too long to say the one thing that could have changed everything. They spoke every single day for a year. Morning texts, late night check-ins, inside jokes, emotional comfort. And somehow they never talked about the one thing that mattered most. Have you ever been close to someone like that? Close enough to feel safe, but not close enough to be honest. Close enough to depend on them, but afraid that naming the connection would ruin it. This isn't a story about cheating. It's not about betrayal or dramatic heartbreak. It's about emotional avoidance, about two people who cared deeply for each other, but were both too afraid to hope again. What happens when comfort becomes a hiding place? What happens when patience starts to feel like pain? And what happens when two people finally realize that silence can hurt just as much as rejection? Welcome to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, where we tell emotional love stories with real-life lessons about relationships, healing, and self-worth. If you believe love should teach us something, not just entertain us, make sure you subscribe, because this story might change the way you see emotional connection. But this story doesn't begin with a confession. It begins with a woman standing alone in her kitchen, staring at a dirty mug, and realizing she was more tired than she wanted to admit. The first thing Maya noticed that morning was how tired her hands felt. Not the sharp, earned tiredness that came from lifting boxes or working too late the night before. This was quieter than that, heavier, as if her hands had been carrying something invisible for a long time and had finally decided to protest. She stood at the kitchen sink, fingers resting against the edge of the counter, staring at a ceramic mug she hadn't washed the night before. A thin ring of dried coffee clung to the inside, stubborn and familiar. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic drifting in from the street below. It wasn't a bad morning. That was the strange part. The light coming through the window was soft, pale gold. The kind of light people liked to photograph. She wasn't late for work. Her bills were paid. Her phone hadn't lit up with any bad news. Still, a wave of disappointment moved through her chest without warning. Not dramatic, not overwhelming. Just there. Maya exhaled slowly, as if letting out a breath she'd been holding without realizing it. She had learned not to make too much of moments like this. Feelings passed if you didn't poke at them too hard. That was one of the rules she lived by now. She reached for the mug, hesitated, then turned on the tap. Warm water rushed over her fingers, and she flinched slightly, not from the heat, but from the sudden awareness of her own body, the ache in her wrists, the stiffness in her shoulders, the quiet exhaustion that seemed to live under her skin these days. She was 32 years old and very good at being functional. She showed up on time. She answered emails promptly. She remembered birthdays and sent thank you texts and made polite conversation at work events. She worked at a nonprofit that helped people find housing, which meant she spent her days listening to other people's problems and reminding herself to be grateful for her own relative stability. From the outside, her life looked steady. From the inside, it felt like she was constantly maintaining balance on a surface that never fully stopped shifting. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Maya glanced at it before she could stop herself. "Morning. You up?" The disappointment eased. Just a little. She smiled. Small and automatic. The way you do when something familiar appears right on time. That happened a lot with him. The timing. The sense that someone, somewhere, was already thinking about her before the day fully began. "Barely," she typed back. "Coffee is doing its best." There was a pause. Never long, but long enough to feel human. "Coffee is a hero," the reply came. "Underrated, underpaid." She huffed a quiet laugh and shook her head. The mug slipped clean under her hands. The dried ring finally gone. She set it in the drying rack and leaned against the counter, phone warm in her palm. This part was easy. The banter, the rhythm, the comfort of knowing that almost every morning, without discussion or obligation, there would be a message waiting for her. Something light, something steady, something that asked nothing of her except to respond. Evan had been there for 367 days. She knew the number because she'd counted once, late at night, when she couldn't sleep and didn't want to think too hard about why. A year plus 2 days. A year of good mornings and good nights, checking in, of sharing fragments of their days, the way some people shared meals. They hadn't meant to become a habit. They'd met the most ordinary way imaginable, through a comment thread under a video neither of them could remember now. A small joke, a reply, a private message that started with something inconsequential and stayed that way just long enough to feel safe. At first, it was nothing. A distraction during lunch breaks, a way to pass time on long evenings. But over time, their conversations stretched, shifted, deepened in quiet, unannounced ways. They talked about work frustrations, about family dynamics, about the strange comfort of grocery stores late at night when the aisles were empty and no one expected anything from you. They knew each other's schedules without ever explicitly asking. Knew when the other would be busy, knew when silence meant stress and when it meant rest. They spoke every day. They never talked about the one thing that mattered. Maya didn't think of it as avoidance. It didn't feel like fear when it happened. It felt like instinct, like gently steering a car away from a road that looked familiar, but led somewhere she didn't want to go again. Whenever the conversation drifted too close, too personal, too loaded, she redirected. A joke, a lighter question, a story that stopped just before the vulnerable part. Evan did the same, though she doubted he realized it either. They were very good at meeting each other right at the edge. Life had taught Maya how to keep things moving. Her last relationship hadn't ended in a fight or a betrayal. There had been no dramatic confession or explosive goodbye. It had simply worn down, day by day, promise by promise, until she realized she was the only one still waiting for things to change. She remembered how careful she'd been near the end, how she'd learned to phrase her needs as suggestions, how she'd stopped asking certain questions altogether, how she'd told herself she was being patient when really she was just shrinking. She hadn't sworn off love after that. She wasn't bitter. She still believed in connection, but something in her had closed just enough to keep her safe. She finished making coffee and carried the mug to the small table by the window. Outside, the city moved the way it always did. Cars inching forward, people walking with purpose, lives unfolding without regard for her quiet thoughts. Her phone buzzed again. "Big day?" Evan asked. "The usual," she replied. "Meetings, emails, saving the world, one spreadsheet at a time. Careful," he wrote. "Hero talk this early in the morning." She smiled, but this time it didn't reach as deep. There was a question sitting just behind her ribs, pressing gently, insistently, one she'd been carrying for weeks now. Months, if she was honest. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand to be asked. Just waited. "What are we doing?" The words felt too heavy to type, too definitive, as if asking them would force an answer she wasn't sure she was ready to receive. An answer that might change the shape of her days, might take something comfortable and make it fragile. So she didn't ask. She took a sip of coffee instead, let the warmth spread through her chest, and typed back something safe. "How about you?" And just like that, the moment passed. Evan replied a minute later. "Already behind," he wrote, which is impressive, considering the day barely started. Maya smiled again, softer this time. She could picture him as he typed, probably already dressed, one hand on his phone, the other wrapped around a travel mug. He had mentioned once that mornings always felt rushed, even when they weren't, as if his body stayed slightly ahead of his mind. "That's your brand," she typed. "Chronically productive, perpetually late." "Wow," he answered. "I feel seen and attacked." She laughed under her breath and shook her head. It was strange how well she knew him, without ever touching his hand or hearing his voice outside of short, infrequent calls. Strange, and yet not unsettling. It felt earned, built slowly, brick by brick, conversation by conversation. She finished her coffee, rinsed the mug again out of habit, and set it carefully in the rack. The small rituals of her morning steadied her. Shoes by the door, keys on the hook, bag packed the night before, order where she could find it. On the walk to work, the city hummed around her. A man jogged past with earbuds in, face set in determined focus. A woman waited impatiently at the crosswalk, tapping her foot. Someone laughed too loudly across the street, the sound bright and fleeting. Maya checked her phone at the corner, not because she expected a message, but because it had become part of the rhythm of her day. There was nothing new. That was fine. It didn't mean anything. She told herself that a lot. At her desk, she slipped into the familiar cadence of emails and meetings. Her job required a kind of quiet empathy, listening carefully, offering reassurance without promising too much. She was good at it. Her supervisor once told her she had a calming presence, the kind that made people feel safe, even when solutions were slow. Maya had thanked her, then wondered privately when she'd learned that particular skill. During lunch, she ate at her desk, scrolling through her phone between bites. Evan sent her a photo of a lopsided sandwich and complained about the bread-to-filling ratio. She responded with mock outrage and unsolicited sandwich advice. It, silly, harmless, it filled the space. By mid-afternoon, the earlier disappointment had dulled, replaced by the manageable tiredness of a day half spent. She leaned back in her chair and stretched, fingers interlacing above her head. The ache was still there, but quieter now. Her phone buzzed again. "Can I ask you something kind of random?" She hesitated before answering, not because the question worried her, but because she recognized the phrasing. Evan often prefaced personal questions this way, as if softening the ground before stepping on it. "Sure," she typed. There was a longer pause. This time, "Do you ever get tired of being the reliable one?" Maya's fingers stilled over the screen. She stared at the question, reading it again, slower. It wasn't invasive. It wasn't dramatic. But it landed somewhere tender. She could feel the familiar instinct rise, the one that told her to deflect, to keep things light, to answer without revealing too much. A joke would be easy. A vague response. Something that acknowledged the question, without opening the door behind it. Her thumbs hovered. "Sometimes," she typed, then deleted it. She tried again. "I guess it depends on the day." That felt safer, less exposed. "Yeah," Evan replied. Same. No follow-up, no probing. Part of her was relieved. Another part, smaller, quieter, felt something like disappointment. She shook it off and returned to her work. But the question lingered with her through the rest of the afternoon. On her way home, she stopped by the grocery store, weaving through aisles she knew by heart. She picked up a few staples, added a frozen meal she probably wouldn't eat, and stood for a moment too long in front of the produce, trying to decide if she had the energy to cook. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. "Made it through the day," Evan wrote. "Barely. Proud of you," she replied. "Survival is underrated." She could imagine his smile at that, slightly crooked, self-aware. They didn't talk on the phone that night. They didn't always. Sometimes the day simply slipped by, and texting was enough. She changed into sweatpants, reheated leftovers, and settled onto the couch with a show she half-watched. At one point, her phone lit up with a message. "You ever wonder if we'd be friends? If we met in a different way?" Her breath caught. Just a little. It was an innocent question, philosophical even, but it nudged closer to the edge they both circled so carefully. She stared at the screen, heart beating a little faster than necessary. Probably, she typed. I think we'd get along anywhere. Yeah, he replied. I think so, too. That was it. The conversation shifted after that, back to safe ground, to shared commentary on the show she mentioned, to small complaints and jokes. Later, as Maya brushed her teeth, she caught her reflection in the mirror and paused. She looked fine, little tired, a little older than she remembered being. Nothing alarming. Still, she leaned closer, studying her own eyes, as if they might offer an answer she hadn't asked for. In bed, the room dark and quiet, she set her phone on the nightstand face down. She told herself it was so she wouldn't be tempted to scroll. Told herself she needed the rest. The truth was, she didn't want to see another message that might make her feel something she wasn't ready to name. Across the city, Evan lay on his own bed, staring at the ceiling. His phone rested on his chest, screen dark. He replayed the day in his head, the questions he'd asked, and the ones he hadn't. He knew Maya well enough now to recognize her carefulness, the way she answered just enough, the way she never pushed him, even when he suspected she wanted to. He admired that about her. It felt respectful, mature. It also made it easier to stay where he was. Evan had learned, through experience, that naming things changed them. Once you said what something was, it demanded something back. Clarity came with expectations, and expectations, if unmet, could turn into disappointment. He liked what Wei had, the steadiness, the absence of pressure, the way their conversations fit into his life without asking him to rearrange it. Still, he couldn't ignore the subtle shift he felt when she didn't text first that morning. Couldn't ignore how quickly he'd noticed, how much it had unsettled him. That surprised him. He rolled onto his side and picked up his phone again, typing and deleting a message twice before setting it down. Tomorrow, he told himself. There was no rush. They spoke every day. There was always tomorrow. And somewhere between comfort and caution, between habit and hope, the one thing that mattered remained quietly, patiently unspoken. Stories like this remind us how easy it is to feel close without feeling certain. If you're finding meaning in this journey, support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. It helps these stories reach more people. They didn't decide to become important to each other. That was something Maya would realize much later, when she tried to pinpoint the moment things shifted. There was no dramatic conversation, no conscious agreement, no internal declaration of this matters now. Importance crept in quietly, disguised as routine. At first, Evan had been someone to talk to when the day felt too long. She remembered those early weeks clearly, how casual everything felt. They exchanged messages while waiting in lines, while reheating food, while pretending to listen during meetings that could have been emails. The conversations were light, observational, filled with small humor that asked nothing of either of them. What are you up to? Same old. You? Trying to convince myself. Laundry counts as productivity. Nothing personal. Nothing loaded. And then, without either of them marking the change, the conversations began to stretch. They lasted longer, drifted later into the night, picked up again earlier in the morning. Evan started remembering details. How she took her coffee, the way she hated cilantro, how Sundays made her restless. Maya noticed the same things about him. How he always texted back faster than he meant to. How he downplayed his own stress. How he asked questions that sounded casual, but lingered afterward. They became each other's pause. Maya found herself checking her phone, not out of boredom, but expectation. If something small happened during the day, a strange interaction, a moment of frustration, a funny sign she passed on the street, her first instinct was to tell Evan. Not because she needed advice, just because sharing it felt natural. That realization should have unsettled her. Instead, she let it settle in like furniture you don't rearrange because it already fits the room. There was comfort in the predictability of him, comfort in knowing that no matter how disjointed the day felt, there would be a place to put the extra thoughts, a place where they'd be received with interest instead of impatience. Evan, on his end, noticed the shift too, though he framed it differently in his mind. For him, Maya became a kind of constant, someone who existed outside the compartments of his life. She wasn't tied to his job or his family or his obligations. She didn't expect anything from him except honesty in small doses, and even that was optional. He liked that. He liked that she didn't ask why he took so long to answer sometimes. That she didn't press when he changed the subject. That she let silence exist without filling it with assumptions. Made him feel respected, safe. What neither of them acknowledged was how easily safety can slide into hiding. They learned each other's rhythms. Maya knew Evan's workdays were heavier on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Evan knew Maya's mood dipped slightly on Sunday nights. They adjusted accordingly, offering distractions or space without needing to explain. It was intimacy, but stripped of risk. One evening, months into their daily exchanges, Maya sat on her couch with her laptop balanced on her knees, pretending to watch something she'd already seen. Her phone buzzed. "What's something you miss that you don't talk about much?" She frowned slightly at the question. It wasn't invasive, but it wasn't light either. It sat in that uncomfortable middle space, the one that invited honesty, but didn't demand it. She considered answering truthfully. She missed feeling chosen, missed the certainty that came from being wanted without hesitation, missed the version of herself that didn't second-guess every emotional impulse. Instead, she typed, "Road trips. I never take them anymore." It wasn't a lie, just incomplete. "Those are overrated," Evan replied. "Too much gas station food." She smiled, grateful for the easy pivot. "Blasphemy," she wrote back. "Gas station snacks are elite." And just like that, the moment passed. This was how it worked between them. Honest enough to feel real, careful enough to avoid damage. Maya told herself that was healthy. She'd done the opposite before, dived in too quickly, said too much too soon, expected emotional clarity from people who weren't ready to give it. She'd learned the cost of that, learned how vulnerable words could be used as currency instead of care. This, whatever this was, felt different. Here, she didn't have to perform vulnerability to earn connection. She could be present without being exposed. She could enjoy the warmth without stepping into the fire. At least, that's what she told herself. The truth revealed itself in small ways, like how her mood lifted noticeably when Evan texted earlier than usual, or how disappointment crept in, quiet but persistent, when his responses were shorter than normal. How she reread certain messages, searching for tone, for subtext, for reassurance he never explicitly offered. She recognized these signs. She'd felt them before. She just chose not to name them. Evan was doing something similar, though he would have resisted the comparison if asked. For him, Maya became the person he talked to when he didn't want to feel alone with his thoughts. She had a way of listening that didn't make him feel examined, a way of responding that didn't rush him toward conclusions. He found himself sharing things with her he didn't bother explaining to anyone else. Not because they were deeply personal, but because they were unfinished. Ideas, frustrations, unsorted emotions. She never tried to fix them. That mattered to him more than he admitted. There were nights when he considered asking her something direct, something clarifying. The question would form fully in his mind, clear and sharp, and then soften before reaching his thumbs. What if asking changed things? What if naming what they were made it heavier than it needed to be? He'd learned that once expectations entered a space, they rarely left quietly. He stayed where he was. Months passed like this. Seasons changed. Summer gave way to fall. The tone of their conversation shifted subtly with the weather. Lighter during warm evenings, more reflective as days grew shorter. They began sharing music, sending each other songs that matched moods neither of them described out loud. Maya noticed that Evan never sent anything that sounded too hopeful, nothing that leaned fully into longing. His playlists hovered safely in between, nostalgic, thoughtful, contained. She wondered, sometimes, if that was deliberate. One night, as she walked home under a sky already dark by early evening, her phone buzzed. Do you think people can care deeply about each other without it meaning anything more? She stopped walking. The question wasn't casual, wasn't dressed up as humor. It sat plainly on the screen, asking to be answered. Her heart thudded once, hard. She could feel the weight of a year's worth of unspoken things pressing behind that single sentence. All the moments they'd circled around something larger. All the almosts. All the deliberate restraint. She knew what the safe answer would be. She also knew what the honest one might cost. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Cars passed. Someone brushed past her shoulder. Life continued around her, unaware of the small crossroads she stood at. Finally, she typed, "I think it can mean whatever people are brave enough to let it mean." There was a long pause, longer than usual. Her chest tightened as she waited, a familiar tension settling in. This was the feeling she tried to avoid, the moment right before clarity, when hope and fear stood shoulder to shoulder. Evan's reply came slowly. "Thou makes sense. Nothing more." Maya stared at the screen, then locked her phone and slipped it into her pocket. She started walking again, her steps measured, controlled. She told herself she was relieved that things hadn't tipped into uncomfortable territory, that the balance had been preserved. Still, as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she felt the subtle ache of something deferred. They spoke every day. They were building something real. They just hadn't decided what to call it. And in that silence, something important waited. Maya noticed the avoidance long before she admitted it to herself. It showed up in the smallest ways. So small, in fact, that it would have been easy to miss if she hadn't lived inside her own thoughts. It was in how she instinctively softened her questions before sending them, how she reread messages and trimmed away anything that felt too direct, how she learned, almost unconsciously, which conversational doors stayed open and which ones quietly closed when approached. She didn't think of it as fear. Fear felt dramatic, loud, obvious. This was quieter, more practical. It felt like maintenance. Evan had his patterns, too. She could trace them now, like familiar cracks in a sidewalk she walked every day. Whenever the conversation edged toward future plans, anything beyond the next few days, he redirected. Not abruptly, not defensively, just enough to keep things grounded in the present. If she mentioned something she wanted to do months from now, he'd respond thoughtfully, then pivot back to something immediate. If she spoke about relationships in general, friends who were getting married, co-workers who were moving in together, he listened without offering commentary that revealed his own position. He stayed just out of reach of definition. Maya told herself she respected that it was mature to allow people their boundaries. She had boundaries, too, after all. She didn't overshare. She didn't demand emotional access. She didn't assume entitlement to anyone's inner world. Still, there were moments, fleeting but persistent, when she felt like they were both standing in front of the same door, pretending it didn't exist. One evening, after a long day that left her more drained than usual, Maya sat curled on her couch with a blanket pulled over her legs. The apartment felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that made thoughts echo. Her phone buzzed. "You okay? You've been quiet tonight." She stared at the message for a moment longer than necessary. It would have been easy to answer, honestly, to say she felt worn down, that she missed having someone physically close sometimes, that being strong all the time was starting to feel lonely. Instead, she typed, "Yeah, just tired." "Same," Evan replied. "This week is dragging." That was that. The thing Maya didn't say, didn't even fully articulate to herself, was that being tired had started to feel like her default. Not just physically, but emotionally, like she was carrying a low-grade exhaustion that sleep didn't quite fix. Some nights she lay in bed scrolling through old messages, not because she was looking for anything specific, but because rereading them gave her a sense of continuity, proof that something steady existed in her life. That, too, should have concerned her. Evan experienced his own version of this quiet reliance. He didn't talk about it out loud, but he noticed how often his hand drifted toward his phone when something stressful happened, how Maya's responses grounded him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. She didn't rush him through his thoughts or minimize his frustrations. She let him sit in them, offered perspective only when asked. It felt healthy, and yet he was aware, on some level, that he was using the space between them as a buffer. As long as things remained undefined, he didn't have to confront questions he wasn't ready to answer. As long as there were no labels, there were no expectations. No one could be disappointed if nothing was promised. That logic had served him well before. Still, there were cracks in it. One Saturday morning, Evan woke earlier than usual and lay in bed scrolling through his phone. The apartment felt empty in a way that annoyed him. He'd planned to enjoy the quiet, catch up on things, maybe go for a run, but instead he found himself restless. Without thinking too much about it, he typed, "What are you up to today?" The response came quickly. Laundry. Errands. Thrilling stuff. He smiled, relief flickering through him at the familiarity. "One company?" he typed, then froze. The words sat there, unsent. He read them again, pulse ticking faster. Was a harmless offer. Casual, normal. Friends did things together all the time. But even that felt like a step. After a moment, he deleted the message and replaced it with something safer. "Sounds productive. I should probably do the same." "Probably," Maya replied. "Whether you will is another story." He laughed softly, the moment passing. But the question lingered with him long after the screen went dark. Why had that felt risky? Across town, Maya folded clothes with her phone propped on the bed, replaying the conversation in her mind. She hadn't missed the pause before Evan's reply. She'd grown sensitive to those pauses. Could mean many things, but they always meant something. She wondered if he'd almost asked her to do something together. The thought sent a small, unwelcome flutter through her chest. She pressed it down. Hope, she reminded herself, needed to be managed. Later that evening, they talked about a movie Evan had watched, and Maya had avoided because she didn't want to feel sad. He teased her about it. She defended herself. The banter flowed easily, but beneath it, both of them were aware of what hadn't been said. They were circling the same question from opposite sides. "What are we doing?" Maya's friends had started asking, gently at first. "So, who's Evan?" one of them had said over brunch, eyebrows raised just enough to signal curiosity. "A friend," Maya had replied automatically. "And you talk every day?" "Pretty much." Her friend had smiled in that knowing way that made Maya feel both seen and exposed. Sounds like more than a friend. Maya had shrugged. Non-committal. It's just easy. She didn't say that ease was starting to feel like a trap. Evan received similar questions from his sister, who noticed patterns the way only siblings could. "You smile at your phone a lot," she'd said once, passing him in the kitchen. He'd scoffed. "Do not." She'd raised an eyebrow. "You do. Who is she? A friend?" Uh-huh. He hadn't elaborated. He didn't need. The label felt sufficient. Protective. Still, late at night, when distractions fell away, he sometimes imagined what it would be like to stop protecting himself, to say something clear, to ask something direct. The thought made his chest tighten. He wasn't afraid of Maya. He was afraid of what wanting her might require. They continued like this, days stacking neatly on top of each other, conversations flowing, meaning building quietly in the gaps. Neither of them made a wrong move. Neither of them made the brave one. From the outside, it might have looked like patience. From the inside, it felt like two people waiting for permission. Neither of them knew how to give. They spoke every day. They shared pieces of themselves. And somewhere in the space between what they said and what they avoided, the one thing that mattered remained just out of reach, untouched, unnamed, and quietly shaping everything they were becoming. Maya hadn't planned to think about her past that afternoon. It happened the way it usually did, without warning, without ceremony. One small thing tugged on another, and suddenly, a memory she'd packed away resurfaced, carrying weight it hadn't lost with time. She was standing in line at a pharmacy after work, phone in hand, half listening to a conversation behind her. A couple argued softly about what brand of vitamins to buy. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of disagreement that came from familiarity, from shared routines. Her chest tightened. She looked down at her phone, thumb hovering over Evan's name, and for a moment, the present blurred with something older. She remembered another line, another store, another version of herself, standing next to someone who once felt certain. Back then, she hadn't been tired in the same way. She'd been hopeful. That relationship had started with intensity. Long conversations, late nights, the thrill of feeling chosen. She'd mistaken urgency for depth, passion for commitment. When the cracks appeared, they were small enough to ignore. A canceled plan here, a delayed conversation there. Each time, she told herself it was temporary. She learned patience in those months, or at least she thought she did. What she actually learned was how to wait quietly. She waited for clarity that never came, waited for reassurance that arrived inconsistently, waited for someone else to decide what she already knew she wanted. And somewhere along the way, she stopped asking directly, not because she didn't care, but because caring started to feel like asking for too much. The erosion had been slow, so slow she hadn't noticed, until she felt smaller inside the relationship than she had before it. Less certain, less expressive, less herself. When it finally ended, there was no explosive moment, no final argument, just an understanding that neither of them was moving forward, and someone had to be the first to stop pretending. That someone had been her. Standing in the pharmacy now, Maya shifted her weight and exhaled. She didn't miss that relationship. Nah, really. What lingered was the lesson it had etched into her habits. Wanting too much makes people leave. Naming needs too clearly creates pressure. Silence keeps things intact. She paid for her items and stepped outside, the cool air brushing against her face. The city moved on around her, indifferent to the quiet recalibration happening inside her chest. Her phone buzzed. "How'd work go?" Evan asked. She typed back quickly. "Long, but manageable." That was her default answer. Honest enough. Contained enough. She didn't mention the memory. Didn't mention the couple in the store. Didn't mention the way her chest still reacted to reminders of what it felt like to hope openly. Evan didn't ask follow-up questions. He rarely did, unless she opened the door wider. He respected that boundary, or at least that's how it felt. Maya appreciated him for it. She also wondered, sometimes, if that respect was mutual avoidance in disguise. That night, she sat at her small kitchen table, with a notebook open in front of her. She'd started journaling again recently, not consistently, but enough to notice a pattern. The pages were filled with observations rather than feelings. Descriptions instead of admissions. She wrote about her days, about work frustrations, about things she'd read or overheard. She almost wrote Evan's name. Her pen hovered. She closed the notebook instead. Some truths felt too close to handle alone. Across the city, Evan sat on his couch, scrolling aimlessly, a muted game playing on the television. He wasn't watching it. His mind drifted, looping back to familiar discomfort he hadn't fully examined yet. He'd always been careful about relationships, not guarded in the obvious ways. He wasn't cold or distant. He showed up. He listened. He cared. But he kept a quiet ledger in his mind, tracking emotional exchanges, noting when something started to feel unbalanced. He'd learned early how easy it was to disappear into someone else's needs. In his last serious relationship, he'd been the steady one, the dependable one, the one who adjusted, accommodated, reassured. At first, it felt good to be needed, purposeful. Over time, it became suffocating. He remembered how his own wants had slowly taken a back seat, how every decision felt like it needed approval, how love had shifted from mutual choice to unspoken obligation. When that relationship ended, he'd promised himself he'd never let that happen again. So now, when things began to matter, he slowed down. He monitored himself carefully. He made sure he wasn't being pulled into something without fully choosing it. Maya felt safe to him, because she didn't demand more than he was ready to give. That should have been enough. But lately, he'd noticed a restlessness creeping in, a sense that something important hovered just beyond the conversations they had. He liked their connection, but he couldn't ignore the way it occupied more of his emotional space than he'd intended. He wondered if that was a warning sign, or simply what closeness felt like when you didn't run from it. He picked up his phone and typed a message, then erased it. Typed again. Do you ever feel like you're holding back parts of yourself on purpose? He stared at the screen, jaw tightening slightly. Too direct. He deleted it and replaced it with something safer. Any plans this weekend? The reply came quickly. Not really? You? Relief and disappointment tangled in his chest. Same, he wrote. Probably just recharge. Sounds nice, Maya replied. And it did. Recharge. Reset. Maintain equilibrium. Yet neither of them could shake the sense that they were expending a lot of energy just to stay where they were. Maya lay in bed later that night, staring at the ceiling, the room lit faintly by the glow of the streetlight outside. Her phone rested on the nightstand, screen dark. She thought about all the ways she'd learned to be careful, all the ways she'd learned to soften her needs so they'd be easier to accept or easier to ignore. She wondered, not for the first time, whether she was protecting herself from pain or from growth. Evan lay awake too, his thoughts circling the same unanswered questions from a different angle. He knew how to keep himself from losing control. He didn't know how to move forward without feeling like he was risking it. Two people, two histories, two sets of lessons learned the hard way. Neither of them broken, just shaped, and quietly, steadily, those shapes were pressing up against each other, testing the limits of what could exist without being named. Maya's mother called the next morning, while she was halfway through making breakfast. "Are you rushing?" her mother asked, instead of saying hello. Maya smiled, despite herself. "Not yet." "What's up?" "Nothing," her mother said quickly, which of course meant something. "I just wanted to hear your voice." Maya leaned against the counter, phone tucked between her shoulder and ear. She listened as her mother talked about small things, the neighbor's new dog, a sale at the grocery store, an article she'd read but couldn't quite summarize. It was familiar, comforting, and layered with the kind of concern that never needed to be spoken directly. "You sound tired," her mother said eventually. Maya hesitated. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't." That was the thing about her mother. She noticed what lived between words. Work's been busy," Maya added. Her mother hummed softly. "And everything else?" Maya looked at the window, at the way the morning light hit the opposite building. She thought, oh, Evan, of the year that had quietly rearranged her emotional life, of how full and unfinished it all felt. "Everything else is steady," she said. Another hum, This one more thoughtful. Well, her mother said gently, steady can be good. Just make sure it's not heavy. After they hung up, Maya stood still for a moment longer than necessary. The comment settled somewhere uncomfortable, not because it was wrong, but because it was accurate in a way she hadn't admitted out loud. She texted Evan a few minutes later. "Good morning." "Hey," he replied. "How are you?" She stared at the question, aware of how often it passed between them, how rarely either of them answered it fully. "Okay," she typed. "You?" "Same." They exchanged a few more messages, light, familiar, but Maya felt the weight of what she hadn't said pressing gently against her chest. Later that day, she met a friend for coffee after work. It was someone she trusted, someone who asked real questions and waited for real answers. "So," her friend said, stirring her drink, "tell me about Evan." Maya froze, just slightly. "There's not much to tell," she said carefully. Her friend smiled. "That's usually not true." Maya laughed, but it sounded thinner than she intended. "He's just someone I talk to a lot." "How long is a lot?" "A year." Her friend's eyebrows lifted. "A year is not nothing." "I know," Maya said quickly. There's no label, no expectations. It's easy." Her friend studied her for a moment. "Is it?" The question landed softly, but it landed. Maya wrapped her hands around her cup, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. "It doesn't hurt," she said. "That's not the same answer." Maya looked up, meeting her friend's eyes. For a moment, she considered telling the truth about the tiredness, about the questions she never asked, about the way she felt suspended between comfort and longing. Instead, she shrugged. "I don't know what I want yet." Her friend nodded slowly. "Just make sure you're not confusing not wanting to be hurt with not wanting anything at all." The words followed Maya home, settling in her thoughts as she changed into comfortable clothes and curled up on the couch. She thought about how carefully she managed her expectations now, how she'd learned to temper hope before it could grow teeth, how she'd convinced herself that ambiguity was safer than certainty. She also thought about Evan's pauses, his careful phrasing, his reluctance to step forward without knowing exactly where he'd land. They were different wounds, but they pulled in the same direction, away from risk. Evan spent that evening at his sister's place, helping her assemble a bookshelf she'd ordered online. "You're quiet," his sister observed, handing him a screw. "The first?" "Yes," she said, "and you're holding that upside down." He adjusted it and sighed. "Just thinking." "Dangerous habit," she teased. Then, more seriously, still talking to that woman every day. He didn't pretend not to know who she meant. "Yeah, and," he shrugged, "it's good." She leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You've been saying that for months." He glanced at her. "What's your point?" "My point is," she said carefully. You don't talk about things you don't care about, and you don't avoid things you don't care about either. Evan tightened the last screw and sat back on his heels. I'm not avoiding anything. She raised an eyebrow. You're thinking very hard for someone who isn't avoiding anything. He smiled despite himself, then sobered. I just don't want to mess it up. She softened. Sometimes not choosing is the choice that messes things up. The comment lingered with him long after he left her apartment. That night, Evan stared at his phone longer than usual before typing. Can I ask you something kind of serious? Maya saw the message while brushing her teeth. She froze. Toothbrush paused mid-air. Her heart beat faster. Not with excitement, but with recognition. This one of those moments. A threshold? Sure, she typed after a moment. There was pause. Longer than usual. Never mind. The next message read. It can wait. Maya closed her eyes, disappointment blooming quietly in her chest. Okay, she replied. They didn't talk much after that. Not because anything was wrong, but because something almost happened. Lying in bed later, Maya stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again. She wondered what he'd almost asked. She wondered why she felt both relieved and let down. Across the city, Evan lay awake too, his phone face down beside him. He told himself he'd done the right thing, that rushing clarity could ruin something good. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that by waiting, he was slowly teaching something meaningful how to disappear. They spoke every day. They cared in careful ways. And beneath that care, both of them carried the same quiet question. How long could something important survive without being named? The rain started sometime after noon. Light at first, the kind that barely darkened the pavement. By the time Maya noticed it, it had settled into something steadier, unhurried, persistent, as if it had nowhere else to be. She watched it from her office window while pretending to read an email for the third time. Her phone sat face down on the desk. She'd turned it that way intentionally. A small act of control, she told herself, meant nothing. After the almost question the night before, everything felt slightly off-kilter. Not broken, just sensitive, like a bruise you forget about until you press it. She hadn't heard from Evan yet that day. That wasn't unusual. Still, she noticed. Around 2 o'clock, her phone buzzed. Random thought, the message read. Want to grab coffee this weekend? Her breath caught. They'd met in person before, but rarely. Those meetings existed in a separate category in her mind, carefully contained, spaced out enough to feel intentional rather than habitual. Coffee was casual, low stakes. Still, her fingers felt heavier than usual as she typed. Sure, she wrote. Saturday. Saturday works, Evan replied. There's a place near the park, if that's okay. Sounds good. And just like that, it was decided. The rest of the workday passed in a blur. Maya moved through her tasks efficiently, but her thoughts kept drifting forward, to the rain, to the park, to the way Evan's smile never quite committed to confidence. She tried not to assign meaning to the invitation, tried not to let anticipation sharpen into expectation. This, just coffee. They were good at keeping things just coffee. Saturday arrived, wrapped in gray. Maya stood in front of her closet longer than she meant to, flipping through options without really seeing them. She wasn't trying to impress him. That wasn't the feeling. It was more about wanting to feel like herself. Comfortable, honest. She settled on a sweater she liked because it was soft and familiar. Jeans that fit without effort. When she checked her reflection, she looked like someone meeting a friend. That felt right. The cafe sat near the edge of the park, its windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside. Maya arrived a few minutes early and paused outside, watching rain bead against the glass. She almost turned around, not because she didn't want to see him, but because there was a flicker of vulnerability in stepping through that door. A quiet acknowledgement that whatever existed between them online didn't stay neatly contained once they occupied the same physical space. She pushed the door open. Evan was already there, seated near the window, folding his umbrella with unnecessary precision. The sight made her smile before could stop herself. He looked mostly like his pictures, a little taller, a little more solid, more real. He glanced up and smiled, something warm but careful lighting his face. "Hey," he said, standing. "Hey," she replied, suddenly aware of her hands, her posture, the sound of her voice. They ordered coffee and sat, the table between them small but noticeable. Outside, rain streaked down the windows, blurring the park into soft shapes. For a few minutes, they talked about safe things, the cafe, the weather, a show they'd both watched. The familiarity helped. The words flowed easily, like picking up a conversation paused only moments ago. Then, slowly, something shifted. Being in the same room changed the texture of everything. Evan's pauses felt more deliberate. Maya noticed the way he watched her when she spoke, attentive without being intrusive. When she laughed, he smiled a second later, as if savoring it. It felt familiar and new at the same time, like slipping into a jacket that had hung in the back of the closet, worn in, but not worn out. When Evan mentioned an upcoming job change, he glossed over the reasons. Maya noticed, but didn't press. When she referenced her last relationship, she kept it light, vague. He nodded, accepting what she offered without asking for more. Neither of them pushed. The coffee cooled between sips. Time moved gently, unmarked. At one point, Evan leaned back slightly and said, "I'm glad we did this." Maya nodded. "Me too." The simplicity of the exchange felt significant, not because it promised anything, but because it acknowledged presence. When they stood to leave, there was a moment of hesitation, an unspoken question about what came next. Then Evan opened the door, holding it for her as they stepped back into the rain. They walked a few blocks together, sharing an umbrella that didn't quite cover them both. Their shoulders brushed once, lightly. Maya felt the contact, like a spark. She refused to examine too closely. At the corner, they stopped. "I'll text you later," Evan said. "Okay." They hugged, brief, polite, safe. The kind of hug that didn't linger long enough to complicate anything. Maya walked the rest of the way home alone, the rain soaking through the hem of her jeans. Her phone stayed in her pocket. She let her thoughts wander freely for once. The meeting hadn't changed anything, and yet it had. Being careful, she realized, didn't stop feelings from forming. It just taught them how to hide. And somewhere beneath the sound of the rain, the quiet question she'd been avoiding pressed a little closer to the surface. Patient, persistent, and no longer content to wait forever. Maya felt the shift later that evening, once the rain had stopped and the city had settled into its nighttime rhythm. She was sitting on her couch, hair still damp from a rushed shower, when her phone buzzed. "I had a good time today," Evan wrote. She stared at the message, letting herself feel it before responding. "Me too," she typed. Then, after a beat, "I'm glad we finally did that." Finally, the word lingered longer than she intended. There was a pause before his reply. "Yeah," he wrote. "It was nice to be in the same space." Nice, safe, neutral. Maya smiled faintly and set her phone down beside her, resisting the urge to reread the message for hidden meaning. She knew better than to overanalyze. At least, she told herself she did. But lying in bed later, the afternoon replayed in her mind with more clarity than she expected. The way Evan had listened, without interrupting. The way his gaze softened when she spoke about something that mattered to her. The way he'd chosen a seat near the window, like he preferred to keep one foot grounded in the world outside. She hadn't felt nervous, exactly. She'd felt aware of the space between them. The words they chose and the ones they avoided, of how easily comfort slid into restraint. The next morning, things returned to normal, or something close to it. They exchanged good morning texts, talked about errands, about nothing in particular. The rhythm resumed, familiar and reassuring. Still, Maya noticed that after meeting in person, the distance between what they felt and what they said felt more pronounced, harder to ignore. She wondered if Evan felt it too. Evan did. He noticed it in how he thought about her voice now, not just the words she sent, but the cadence of her laughter, the pauses when she considered something carefully before answering. Seeing her in person had added texture to his thoughts in a way he hadn't anticipated. It made her harder to keep compartmentalized. He told himself that was fine. That connection didn't require definition to be meaningful. That people could enjoy each other's presence without rushing to label it. But there was a subtle tension beneath that logic. He found himself wanting to ask her questions that felt too direct, wanting to know how she saw him, wanting to understand where she placed him in her life. Each time he stopped himself, he remembered how it felt when love turned into responsibility, how expectations had crept in quietly, reshaping his days until he felt less like himself than before. He wasn't ready to risk that again. So instead, he stayed where he was, present, attentive, but careful not to step forward without certainty. Days passed. Then weeks. They saw each other a few more times. Always casual. Always low pressure. Coffee, a walk. Once, a late lunch that stretched longer than planned. Each meeting reinforced the same truth. They were comfortable together. And comfort, Maya realized, could be deceptive. One evening, after a particularly long day, she sat on the edge of her bed and stared at her phone, a familiar question pressing at her chest. What are we doing? It felt heavier now, more urgent, not because she needed an answer immediately, but because avoiding it was starting to feel dishonest. She opened a text to Evan and typed the words, then deleted them. Typed again. Deleted again. Her heart beat faster, not with fear, exactly, but with the awareness that asking the question might change the shape of something she valued. Across the city, Evan stared at his own phone, sensing, without any concrete reason, that something was shifting. He couldn't explain it, but the ease they'd shared for so long felt thinner lately, like a surface stretched tight. He wondered if Maya felt it too. He wondered how long they could keep balancing on the edge, without tipping one way or the other. That night, neither of them said what they were thinking. They exchanged a few light messages, shared a joke, wished each other good night. But as Maya set her phone down and turned off the light, she felt the quiet disappointment return. Not sharp, not dramatic, just persistent. She wasn't broken. She wasn't unhappy. She was simply tired of holding something important at arm's length. And for the first time, she wasn't sure how much longer she was willing to keep pretending that was enough. The tiredness changed shape. Maya noticed it one Sunday night while folding laundry on her bed, the television murmuring in the background. It wasn't the end-of-week exhaustion she was used to, the kind that came from packed schedules and early mornings. This felt more specific, more pointed, anticipatory. She folded a shirt, then unfolded it, smoothing the fabric again, for no real reason. Her phone sat beside her, screen dark. She hadn't checked it in a while, which was unusual for her. Not because she was avoiding Evan exactly, but because she didn't want to feel the small jolt of expectation that came with seeing his name. Sundays had become difficult in subtle ways. They marked time too clearly. Another week passed. Another set of conversations logged. Another stretch of closeness without clarity. She sat back against the headboard and let her head rest for a moment. The apartment felt quiet in that hollow way it sometimes did at night. Not lonely. She had friends, plans, a life, but unfinished. Her phone buzzed. You survive the weekend? Evan asked. She smiled faintly. Barely, she replied. Laundry almost took me out. Thoughts and prayers, he wrote. She laughed, but it faded quickly. The banter no longer distracted her the way it once had. It still comforted her, but now it also highlighted what was missing. She stared at the blinking cursor, fingers hovering. There it was again, the question, Louder than before? What are we doing? She imagined asking it, imagined the pause on the other end, the careful response, the possibility, however remote, that he might not have an answer she wanted to hear. Her chest tightened. She typed something safer instead. "What about you?" "Caught up on errands," Evan replied, trying to feel prepared for the week. Prepared? The word landed strangely. Prepared for more of the same. Maya closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. She wasn't asking for a commitment. She wasn't asking for promises or plans or guarantees. She just wanted honesty about where they stood, about whether the connection she felt was shared or imagined. She wanted to stop guessing. The realization surprised her. She'd grown so accustomed to managing her expectations that she hadn't noticed how much energy it took, how much of herself she kept folded away, neat and untouched. She opened her notes app and stared at a blank page. G didn't write anything, just sat there, letting the quiet stretch. Somewhere along the way, patience had turned into self-denial. Evan sensed the shift from his side too, though he couldn't have articulated it if asked. He sat at his kitchen table with a half-finished meal in front of him, phone in hand, rereading Maya's messages from the day. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was off. And yet, something felt heavier. He'd always prided himself on being emotionally aware, on knowing his limits, on not rushing into things that could unbalance him. But lately, he felt less certain about where those limits were. He noticed how his mood dipped when Maya took longer to reply, how he felt a quiet relief when her messages arrived right on time, how the idea of her stepping back, even slightly, unsettled him more than he expected. That bothered him. Dependence had crept in quietly. He wasn't relying on her to fix anything. He wasn't asking her to carry his emotional weight. But she'd become a constant presence, and the thought of losing that steadiness made his chest tighten. He told himself that didn't mean what he feared it might mean. It just meant he cared. Still, he couldn't ignore the fact that caring came with responsibility, with choices, and choices required clarity. He thought about the almost questions he'd swallowed over the past weeks, the moments when he'd sensed Maya waiting for something, an acknowledgement, a step forward, and had chosen not to move. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He was trying not to lose himself. But maybe those two goals weren't as separate as he'd believed. That night, Maya lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, the familiar quiet pressing in. She replayed small moments from the past year, not the dramatic ones, but the ordinary ones, the messages sent without thinking, the jokes that landed just right, the way Evan remembered details that others forgot. These weren't sign of nothing. She turned onto her side and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She wasn't asking for certainty, she reminded herself. She was asking for direction. Evan lay awake too, phone face down beside him, thoughts circling the same unresolved center. He wondered how long he could continue choosing comfort over clarity without something giving way. They spoke every day. They cared in measured ways. But the space between what they felt and what they were willing to say was growing heavier, and both of them could feel it pressing closer, demanding to be addressed. The question came from someone else first. Maya hadn't expected that. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind that blended seamlessly into the rest of the week. She was in the break room at work, waiting for the microwave to finish, when one of her coworkers leaned against the counter beside her. "So," the woman said casually, "are you seeing anyone?" Maya blinked. "What?" The coworker smiled. "You just seem lighter lately. Distracted, maybe. In a good way." Maya laughed too quickly. "I don't know about that." The microwave beeped, sharp and abrupt. She reached for her container, grateful for the interruption. "Well?" the coworker pressed, not unkindly. "Anyone special?" Maya hesitated. The answer rose automatically. No, but it caught in her throat. Not because it was untrue, but because it felt incomplete. "I don't know," she said instead. The coworker nodded slowly, like she understood more than Maya had intended to reveal. "Those are usually the complicated ones." Maya carried her lunch back to her desk, the comment echoing louder than it should have. She stared at her screen without really seeing it, the words, "I don't know," looping in her mind. She didn't know. That was the problem. That evening, she mentioned it to Evan almost offhandedly, as if it didn't matter. "Someone at work asked if I was seeing anyone today," she typed. There was a pause before his reply. "And?" he asked. Maya stared at the screen, pulse quickening. "And I said I didn't know," she wrote, keeping the tone light, which felt like the safest answer. Another pause, slightly longer this time. "That's fair," Evan replied. Something in her tightened. It wasn't what he said. It was how easily he said it. How neatly the response closed the door on anything more. She set her phone down and stared at the wall, the familiar disappointment settling in. Not sharp, not dramatic, persistent. They continued texting after that, but the ease was thinner. Conversations stayed on the surface. Jokes landed, but without the warmth they usually carried. That night, Maya lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the coworker's question replaying in her mind. "Are you seeing anyone?" She realized, with a quiet ache, that she'd been living in the space between yes and no for a long time now, a space that required constant emotional balance, constant restraint. She wasn't angry at Evan. She was tired of pretending that ambiguity didn't cost her anything. The next morning, she didn't text first. It wasn't a decision she made consciously. She simply noticed the time passing and chose not to fill the silence. Not as punishment, not as a test, as information. Evan noticed immediately. He told himself not to overthink it. That Maya was busy. That morning's didn't always follow the same rhythm. Still, the hours stretched uncomfortably. He checked his phone more often than usual, irritation creeping in, not at her, but at himself. He hadn't realized how much he relied on that good morning exchange to anchor his day. When Maya finally texted in the early afternoon, her message was normal, friendly, familiar, and yet Evan felt a sharp relief he hadn't expected. That unsettled him more than her silence had. He realized then how easily their connection had woven itself into his emotional routine. How much of his steadiness came from knowing she was there. He thought back to her message from the night before. "I don't know." He wondered what she'd hoped he would say. He wondered if his carefulness had begun to feel like indifference. That evening, he typed out a message he didn't send. "I don't want you to feel like you're waiting." He erased it, typed another. "I care about you." He stared at the words, chest tight, then deleted them too. Clarity demanded courage. Courage demanded risk. And Evan wasn't sure he was ready to risk changing something that had brought him so much quiet comfort. Maya sensed the distance growing, not because Evan pulled away dramatically, but because nothing shifted at all. The same patterns continued, unchanged. That was what hurt. She wasn't asking for more time. She'd already given plenty of that. She was asking for movement, for acknowledgement that what they shared existed beyond habit. That weekend, she went for a long walk alone, letting the cool air clear her head. She watched couples pass, some holding hands, some walking in silence, some arguing quietly. None of them looked perfect, but they looked decided. The realization settled heavily in her chest. She didn't need certainty. She needed honesty about whether Evan was willing to move towards something, even slowly. And for the first time since they'd started talking, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that staying quiet might cost her more than speaking up ever could. Across the city, Evan sat at his kitchen table long after dinner, phone in hand, staring at Maya's name. He understood, suddenly, that doing nothing was no longer neutral. It was a choice, and choices, whether made deliberately or not, always carried consequences. They spoke every day, but now the silence between certain words was louder than anything they'd said. Sometimes, the most painful moments in love aren't arguments. They're the quiet realizations. Realizing you're waiting. Realizing you're holding back. Realizing silence is starting to cost you. If you've ever been in a situation where you didn't know whether to stay patient or speak up, share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story is resonating with you, like the video and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson so you don't miss what happens next. The tension didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in quietly, the way fog does, thin at first, almost unnoticeable, until suddenly everything felt slightly harder to see. Maya noticed it in the pauses, not the comfortable ones they'd always shared, but the new kind, the ones that stretched a second too long, carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Conversations still happened every day, but something in their rhythm had changed. The ease was intact, yet fragile, like glass handled too carefully. She found herself choosing her words with more precision than usual, aware of how much rested on small exchanges. It was exhausting in a way she hadn't expected. On Wednesday evening, after a long day that left her head aching and her patience thin, Maya sat at her kitchen table with a bowl of reheated soup she barely touched. The apartment felt close, the air heavy. Her phone buzzed. "How's your night going?" Evan asked. She stared at the message. Spoon paused halfway to her mouth. The honest answer hovered, unsaid. "I'm tired of guessing." Instead, she typed, "Quiet." "You?" "Same," he replied. "Trying to unwind." She sighed and leaned back in her chair, eyes closing briefly. This was the pattern now. Honest feelings, reduced to manageable summaries. Nothing technically wrong. Nothing clearly broken. Just unresolved. Maya set her phone down and stared at the ceiling. She thought about her coworkers' question, her friend's warning, her mother's gentle concern, all the mirrors life had held up lately, reflecting the same truth from different angles. She couldn't unsee it anymore. Across town, Evan sat on his couch, television muted, phone in hand. He felt restless, pacing between rooms without purpose. The unease had been building for days now, a low hum under everything else. He replayed Maya's message from earlier. "Quiet. You?" And wondered what it didn't say. He knew her well enough now to recognize restraint when he saw it. He also knew himself well enough to recognize avoidance. The realization unsettled him. He wasn't indifferent. If anything, the problem was the opposite. He cared enough that losing what they had scared him more than the uncertainty of not defining it. But the cost of staying still was starting to reveal itself. He typed a message, hesitated, erased it, typed again. "Can we talk this weekend?" His thumb hovered over Chend. This wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confession. It was simply an acknowledgement that something needed attention. The thought made his chest tighten. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Maya saw the message almost immediately. Her heart skipped, not with excitement, but with recognition. This was the moment she'd been bracing for, consciously or not. "Sure," she replied. "What's up?" "There nothing bad," Evan wrote. "I just think we should probably check in." Check in. The phrase was careful, neutral, but it carried weight. "Okay," she typed. "When?" "Saturday? Maybe a walk." She exhaled slowly. "Saturday works." After that, neither of them said much. The conversation drifted back to surface topics, but the awareness remained. Something had shifted. A line had been drawn, even if neither of them had crossed it yet. Saturday came with clear skies and crisp air. Maya arrived at the park early, hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. She watched people pass, joggers, families, couples walking in comfortable silence. The normalcy of it all felt surreal. When Evan appeared, she noticed immediately how serious he looked. Not tense, but focused. Present in a way that made her chest tighten. "Hey," he said, offering a small smile. "Hey." They started walking, side by side, the path stretching ahead of them. For a few minutes, they talked about the weather, about the park, about nothing at all. It felt like circling the edge of something deep. Finally, Evan slowed his pace. "I've been thinking," he said. Maya nodded, heart steady but alert. "I don't want you to feel like you're waiting," he continued, "or like I'm keeping you in some kind of in-between." She stopped walking. He turned to face her, expression earnest. "That's fair," she said quietly. "Because sometimes I do feel like that," he swallowed, nodding. "I figured." They stood there, the space between them suddenly charged. "I'm not trying to avoid you," he said. I move slowly when things matter." "I know," Maya replied. "I do too. But slow and still aren't the same thing." The words landed between them, heavy but true. Evan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I care about you," he said. "I just get scared of doing this wrong, of promising something I can't live up to." "I'm not asking for promises," Maya said gently. "I'm asking for honesty." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing the cost of his caution for the first time. "I don't know what this turns into," he admitted, "but I don't want to keep pretending it's nothing." Maya felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, but recognition. "That's all I needed to hear," she said. "That it's something, and that we're allowed to talk about it." They stood there a moment longer, the noise of the park filling the space around them. Nothing had been resolved, but something important had finally been named. And for the first time in a long while, the silence between them felt less like avoidance and more like room to breathe. They didn't touch after that, not because either of them didn't want to, but because the conversation had shifted something fundamental, and both of them seemed to understand instinctively that rushing into physical closeness would blur what they'd just made clear. So they walked, side by side, not too close, not far apart either. The path curved gently through the park, leaves crunching underfoot. The air was cool enough to wake the senses, sharp enough to keep them present. Maya noticed details she usually missed. The way sunlight filtered through bare branches, the sound of a dog barking somewhere in the distance. Evan broke the silence first. "I've been thinking a lot about why I hesitate," he said. "Not with you. In general." Maya nodded, eyes forward. She appreciated that he wasn't framing this as something she needed to fix or reassure him about. "I think," he continued slowly, "I'm afraid that once I name something, I'll lose control over it. That expectations will start stacking up, and I'll end up failing someone I care about." Maya considered his words carefully. I get that, she said, but from where I'm standing, not naming it also creates expectations. They're just invisible ones. He glanced at her. What do you mean? When you don't say where you stand, she explained. The other person fills in the blanks. Sometimes with hope, sometimes with doubt. Either way, it takes energy. He absorbed that quietly. They walked a few more steps before he spoke again. I didn't realize how much energy this was costing you. She smiled faintly. I didn't either. Not at first. They reached a bench overlooking a small pond and sat. The space between them remained intentional, not distant, just respectful. For what it's worth, Evan said, I never wanted you to feel like you were asking for too much. I know, Maya replied. That's why this was so confusing. You never did anything wrong. You just never did anything clear. He let out a soft breath. Yeah. Silence settled again, but this time it felt different, less loaded, less performative. I don't need us to rush, Maya said, after a moment. I just need us to be honest when things feel off, even if we don't know what to do about it yet. Evan nodded slowly. I can do that. The simplicity of the promise surprised them both. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a commitment to a future. It was something smaller and somehow more solid. They stood to leave as the sun dipped lower in the sky. I'm glad we talked, Evan said. Me too. When they hugged this time, it lasted a second longer than before. Still safe, still careful, but warmer. That night, Maya went home feeling lighter, not because everything was solved, but because she'd stopped carrying the uncertainty alone. She texted Evan later. Something simple, something real. Thanks for today. Thank you, he replied, for saying what you needed. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. For the first time in a long while, Maya slept without replaying conversations in her head. Evan slept, too, his thoughts quieter than they'd been in weeks. Nothing about their situation was suddenly easy, but it was honest. And that, they both realized, changed the weight of everything that came next. The days after the conversation felt different. Not louder, not more dramatic, but steadier. Maya noticed it first in herself, in how her shoulders felt less tense when she woke up, in how she no longer replayed every message, searching for what might be missing. The questions were still there, but they no longer pressed so urgently. They had been acknowledged, and that alone softened them. Their conversations didn't suddenly become deeper or more intense. If anything, they were quieter, more intentional. When Evan asked how her day was, she answered honestly. When she felt tired, she said so. When something bothered her, she named it gently instead of smoothing it over. He met her there, not perfectly. Sometimes he still hesitated, still paused longer than she expected. But now, those pauses didn't feel like avoidance. They felt like thought. One evening, Maya texted him, "I had a rough day today. Nothing dramatic, just truth." Evan replied a minute later, "Do you want to talk about it? Or do you want distraction?" The question caught her off guard. She sat with it for a moment before answering. Talking would be nice. And he listened, not trying to fix anything, not rushing her to feel better, just listening. That mattered more than she could explain. Evan felt the shift too, though it made him slightly uneasy at first. Being more open meant being more visible. It meant that if he pulled back, Maya would notice and might say something. That awareness scared him, but it also grounded him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't navigating closeness alone in his head. He was sharing the responsibility of it. They met again a week later, this time without pretense. Maybe no casual excuses, just a plan, made clearly. They walked through the same park, the air colder now, the trees barer. The familiarity comforted them. "How are you really doing?" Maya asked as they walked. Evan thought about it before answering. "Better? A little uncomfortable, but better." She smiled. "Same." They talked about boundaries, not as rules, but as needs. About pacing, about how neither of them wanted to feel rushed or restrained. "I don't want us to become each other's emotional crutch," Evan said. "I've been there before. I don't want to disappear into patience," Maya replied. "I've done that too." They exchanged a look, mutual recognition. This wasn't about fixing past wounds. It was about not letting those wounds quietly run the present. Still, the differences between them didn't vanish. There were moments when Maya leaned forward emotionally, wanting reassurance Evan wasn't ready to give yet. Moments when Evan pulled back slightly, needing space to recalibrate. One Friday night, after a long stretch of easy conversation, Maya noticed Evan growing quieter. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said quickly, then paused. "Actually, I need a little time tonight. My head's kind of full." The old version of her might have smiled and said it was fine, while wondering what she'd done wrong. This time, she nodded. "Thanks for telling me. Talk tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" he confirmed. When they hung up, Maya felt the familiar flicker of uncertainty, but it didn't spiral. She reminded herself that space wasn't rejection. That needing time wasn't the same as pulling away. And for the first time, that reminder actually worked. Evan spent that evening alone, grateful for the space, but also aware of something new. He missed her presence when it wasn't there. Not desperately, not anxiously, just honestly. The next morning, he texted first. "Thanks for understanding last night." Maya smiled when she read it. "Thanks for being honest." Progress, she realized, didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like learning how to take. Progress didn't erase their differences. It just made them easier to see without flinching. Maya noticed that Evan still moved cautiously around emotional language. He chose his words carefully, often circling a feeling before stepping into it. Where she was learning to speak up sooner, he was still learning how not to retreat when things felt uncertain. And Evan noticed how quickly Maya's instincts leaned toward connection, how she reached out when something felt off, how she preferred to talk things through rather than let them sit. It was something he admired, and something that sometimes overwhelmed him. Neither of them was wrong. They were simply different. One evening, after a long day, Maya texted Evan something small but honest. "I miss you tonight." The words sat on the screen for a moment before she sent them. Her heart beat a little faster than usual, not with fear, but with the awareness that she was naming something instead of hiding it. Evan read the message and felt his chest tighten. He missed her, too. That part was easy to recognize. What made him hesitate was what the statement seemed to invite: reassurance, closeness, something he didn't want to mishandle. He stared at the screen, the old instinct rising. Respond carefully. Keep things neutral. Don't create expectations. Then he remembered the park, the conversation, the promise he'd made. Honesty. "I miss you too," he typed. Nothing more, nothing less. Maya read the message and felt something settle inside her. Not excitement, not relief, but steadiness. It was enough. It didn't overpromise. It didn't retreat. It simply met her where she was. They saw each other later that week, cooking dinner together in Maya's apartment. It was the first time they'd done something that felt quietly domestic, and both of them noticed the weight of that. They moved around each other carefully, negotiating space in the small kitchen. Evan washed vegetables while Maya chopped. Their arms brushed occasionally. Accidental, but noticeable. They talked about mundane things, the best way to cook rice, a podcast Evan had been listening to, a story from Maya's workday. The simplicity felt grounding. After dinner, they sat on the couch, not touching, but close enough to feel each other's warmth. "This feels nice," Evan said after a while. Maya smiled. "Does?" She didn't add anything else. She didn't need to. Later, when Evan stood to leave, there was a moment, an unspoken question hanging in the air. Maya felt it, but she didn't rush to fill the space. Evan hesitated, then leaned in and kissed her. It was gentle, unhurried, more exploratory than declarative. When they pulled back, neither of them said anything. They didn't need to define it. The kiss didn't change everything, but it changed enough. After that, they continued in the same careful rhythm, now with a new layer of awareness. Physical closeness entered the picture slowly, intentionally. They checked in. They paused when something felt unclear. There were missteps. Once Evan canceled plans last minute, overwhelmed by work, and Maya felt the old fear rise, the instinct to minimize her disappointment. This time, she told him she'd been looking forward to seeing him and felt let down. He listened, apologized without defensiveness, rescheduled. Another time, Maya pushed for reassurance Evan wasn't ready to give. He told her he needed time to process instead of withdrawing completely. They adjusted. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. One night, as they lay side by side on Maya's bed, not touching, the room quiet except for the hum of the city outside, Evan spoke softly. "I'm glad we didn't rush this." Maya turned her head to look at him. "Me too." She meant it? Rushing might have felt easier, more exciting, but it wouldn't have taught them how to stay present with discomfort, with difference, with themselves. They were learning, not how to fix each other, but how to make room. And that, Maya realized, was the kind of love she'd been hoping for all along, even when she hadn't known how to ask for it. What surprised Maya most wasn't how much had changed, but how much hadn't. They still spoke every day, still shared small observations, jokes, fragments of their routines. The difference now was subtle, but profound. The conversations no longer felt like a performance balanced on unspoken rules. They felt lived in. Maya noticed it on a Thursday afternoon, when she texted Evan without overthinking the phrasing. "Today feels heavy." No explanation, no softening. The message sat there, honest and unadorned. Evan replied a few minutes later. "Do you want company, space, or a voice on the phone?" She stared at the screen, throat tightening, not with emotion exactly, but with recognition. This was new, not the question itself, but the ease of it, the assumption that her needs could be named without cost. "Maybe a voice," she wrote. He called right away. They didn't talk about anything dramatic. Maya told him about a meeting that had gone sideways, about the exhaustion of caring deeply in a job that never felt finished. Evan listened, murmuring acknowledgement now and then, offering perspective only when she asked. When they hung up, she felt lighter, not because the problems were solved, but because she hadn't carried them alone. This, she realized, was what emotional support looked like when it wasn't transactional. Evan was learning too. He noticed how much easier it felt to stay present when he didn't have to guess what Maya needed. When she told him directly, the pressure he'd always associated with closeness eased. Honesty, it turned out, didn't trap him. It freed him. Still, old habits didn't disappear overnight. There were moments when Evan felt the familiar urge to pull back, when the closeness felt like it might tip into expectation, when his chest tightened at the thought of being needed in ways he wasn't sure he could sustain. One night, after a particularly long week, Maya suggested they spend the weekend together. No plans, just time. Evan felt the instinctive flicker of panic, not because he didn't want to see her. He did, but the word together carried weight. It implied continuity, presence, a kind of shared space he was still learning how to inhabit. He didn't answer right away. Maya noticed the pause and felt her own familiar reflex rise. the urge to backtrack, to soften the request before it became too much. She stopped herself. "I'm okay if the answer's no," she added gently. "I just wanted to ask instead of guessing." Evan exhaled slowly, grateful for the clarity. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "I do want to see you. I just might need a little breathing room, too." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "That's okay. We can figure out something that works for both of us." They did. They planned one evening together instead of a full weekend. It wasn't a compromise born of sacrifice. It was one built on honesty. And it worked. Maya noticed how differently her body responded now when Evan asked for space. The fear still flickered, but it no longer took over. She reminded herself he wasn't disappearing. He was communicating. Evan noticed how much steadier he felt, knowing Maya would tell him when something hurt, instead of letting it build quietly. The responsibility he'd once feared felt more like shared awareness than obligation. They were learning a new rhythm, one that didn't require either of them to abandon themselves to maintain connection. One evening, as they walked through the city after dinner, Evan said something that surprised them both. "I used to think love was about not needing anything," he admitted, "about being self-contained." Maya glanced at him. And now I think it's about knowing what you need and not making someone else guess." She smiled. "That sounds healthier." He laughed softly. "It feels healthier." They stopped at a crosswalk, the light casting their shadows long across the pavement. Evan reached for her hand. Not urgently, not possessively, just there. She let him. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like a milestone. It felt natural. Progress, Maya realized, wasn't measured by how fast things moved. It was measured by how little she felt the need to disappear to keep them moving at all. The more honest they became, the more visible the differences between them felt. Not as obstacles, but as contours. Maya was someone who processed out loud. When something bothered her, she wanted to talk through it, even if she didn't yet know what she felt. Silence for her often felt like abandonment, an echo of being left to carry things alone. Evan processed inward. He needed time to sit with his reactions before he could name them. Silence, for him, wasn't withdrawal. It was preparation. They had to learn how to translate. One night, after a long conversation about work and life and everything in between, Evan grew quiet. Not abruptly, just slowly, as if his energy were dimming. Maya noticed immediately. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, then paused. "I'm just full right now. Emotionally." The word would have unsettled her before. Now she took a breath. "Do you want to stop talking for tonight? Or do you want me to sit with you quietly?" He looked at her, surprised. "You're really okay with that?" "I'm learning to be," she said honestly. He smiled. something soft and grateful in his expression. Quiet would be nice. They sat together without speaking. The room dim, the city murmuring outside. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't empty. It was intentional. Later, Evan realized something had shifted inside him. The silence hadn't felt like pressure to perform. It hadn't felt like a test. It felt like trust. There were moments, too, when Maya struggled. Once, Evan took longer than usual to respond to a message. Nothing alarming. Just hours instead of minutes. But the old anxiety flared anyway. Sharp and familiar. She caught herself before spiraling. Instead of retreating or pretending she didn't care, she named it. "Hey," she wrote, "I'm noticing my brain making up stories because I haven't heard back. Just wanted to say that instead of letting it stew." Evan read the message and felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, but respect. "Thanks for telling me," he replied. "I got pulled into something at work. I'm here now." The reassurance landed differently because it wasn't demanded. They began to understand that healing didn't mean erasing old instincts. It meant responding to them differently. There were setbacks. A few weeks later, Evan canceled dinner plans, last minute again, overwhelmed and overstimulated. Maya felt the familiar disappointment rise. Sharper this time, because she'd allowed herself to hope more freely. She didn't pretend it was fine. "I understand why you canceled," she said later. "But I also need you to know it hurt." Evan swallowed. The urge to defend himself surfaced. "I had a good reason." But he pushed it aside. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have checked in sooner, instead of disappearing." They sat with the discomfort, instead of rushing to smooth it over. It passed. What replaced it wasn't perfection, but resilience. They were learning that love didn't require them to become new people. It required them to become more honest versions of who they already were. One afternoon, months into this new rhythm, Maya realized something quietly astonishing. She wasn't tired in the same way anymore. Life was still demanding. Work was still heavy. Days were still long. But the constant emotional vigilance, the scanning, the guessing, the self-silencing that had drained her for so long had eased. Evan noticed his own shift, too. Closeness no longer felt like a threat to his autonomy. He still needed space. He still valued independence. But now, those needs existed alongside connection instead of competing with it. One evening, as they sat on the floor, assembling a piece of furniture neither of them particularly liked, Evan laughed and shook his head. "You know," he said, "this would have freaked me out a year ago." "Would have?" Maya asked. "Building something together without knowing exactly where it's going." She smiled. Now it feels doable." They exchanged a look. No grand declarations, no promises, just shared presence. The kind built slowly, deliberately, through choices made in small moments. The kind that didn't need to rush to prove itself. The kind that lasted because it was allowed to grow at the pace of real people, learning how to stay. A year passed without ceremony. No anniversary marked on a calendar. No moment where either of them stopped and said, "Look how far we've come." Time simply kept moving, and they moved with it, sometimes in step, sometimes adjusting their pace to match each other again. Maya noticed the change one morning while brushing her teeth. It was a small thing, almost laughable. She caught her reflection in the mirror and realized she wasn't bracing herself for the day the way she used to. There was no low-level tension in her shoulders, no quiet rehearsal of what she'd say or how she'd act. The familiar readiness to manage, to soften, to prepare for disappointment was gone, or at least quieter. She smiled at herself, surprised. That version of tiredness, the one that came from carrying unspoken things, had loosened its grip. Evan was already awake when she walked into the kitchen, sitting at the table with his laptop open, half focused on something he'd been reading. "Morning," he said, looking up. "Morning." She poured coffee and sat across from him. The scene so ordinary, it felt almost surreal. There was a time when even imagining this kind of ease would have felt dangerous. Now, it just felt like life. They didn't talk much at first. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't a gap to be filled. It was a shared pause, comfortable and unremarkable. Later that day, while walking to work, Maya thought about how differently she experienced waiting now. Waiting used to feel like holding her breath. Now, it felt like trusting the air would still be there when she exhaled. Evan noticed his own shift in quieter ways. He still valued his independence, still needed time alone, still felt the pull to retreat inward when overwhelmed. The difference was that he no longer disappeared. When he needed space, he named it. When he felt unsure, he said so. When he felt close to her, he didn't rush to downplay it. He wasn't less careful. He was more present. That afternoon, Maya texted him something small. "Just thinking about you." He smiled when he read it. Not because it demanded anything, but because it didn't. "Same," he replied. No overthinking, no weighing of implications. Just truth. They met that evening at Maya's apartment. Takeout spread across the table, the room dim except for a single lamp. It was the kind of night that used to feel significant simply because it existed. Now, it was just Tuesday. You ever think about how different this feels from the beginning? Maya asked casually, picking at her food. Evan considered the question. "Yeah," he said. "I used to feel like I was constantly calculating." She nodded. "Me too. Like I had to earn clarity by being patient enough." He looked at her. "I'm sorry." She shook her head gently. "You don't have to be. We both brought our stuff into this." They shared a quiet smile. "I think," Evan said slowly, "I was afraid that if I leaned in, I'd lose myself." And I was afraid that if I leaned in, I'd be left, Maya replied. They let the honesty sit between them without rushing to resolve it. What changed? He asked. Maya thought for a moment. We stopped pretending our fears didn't exist. Evan nodded. We stopped making them each other's problem. That felt right. Later, as they sat on the couch, shoulders touching, Evan rested his head back and exhaled. You know, he said, I don't feel like I'm being fixed here. Maya smiled softly. Good. I don't want to fix you, and I don't feel like I need to protect myself all the time either. She turned to look at him. Me neither. The realization was quiet, but it settled deeply. They hadn't healed each other. They'd created space where healing didn't have to be hidden. And in that space, something steady had grown. Something that didn't rush toward the future, but didn't fear it either. Not a promise, not a guarantee, just two people choosing presence again, the way they'd learned to do, one honest moment at a time. The question came unexpectedly, on an evening that felt entirely ordinary. They were sitting on the couch, the room lit by the glow of a single lamp, a half-finished show playing in the background. Maya was scrolling through something on her phone, Evan's arm resting loosely along the back of the couch, not holding her, just there. You know, Evan said, eyes still on the screen. We never really talked about what we were afraid of losing. Maya paused, phone lowering slightly. She turned to look at him. What do you mean? He shifted, thoughtful. Back then, when we first started talking, we avoided a lot. I think we were both protecting something. She considered that, letting the question settle. I was afraid of losing myself again, she said slowly, of shrinking to fit someone else's uncertainty. Then nodded. I was afraid of losing my independence, of waking up one day and realizing I'd slowly disappeared into being needed. They sat with that honesty, the air between them quiet but open. What's funny, Maya said after a moment, is that neither of those things happened. No, Evan agreed, because we finally talked about them. He reached for her hand then, threading his fingers through hers without urgency. The gesture felt natural, an extension of the conversation rather than a punctuation mark. I don't think love is supposed to feel like self-sacrifice all the time, Maya said softly. I don't either, he replied. I think it's supposed to feel like addition. She smiled at that. There was no grand declaration after that. No sudden promise of forever. They didn't need What mattered was the recognition, the shared understanding that what they'd built wasn't fragile because it had been named. It was stronger because it had survived being named. Later that night, as Maya lay awake beside Evan, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, she reflected on how far they'd come. Not from distance to closeness, from silence to honesty. That was the real shift. She remembered the early days, the careful jokes, the avoided questions, the quiet fatigue she'd carried in her body. She remembered how tired her hands had felt that first morning, how much effort it had taken just to hold everything steady. Now, the tiredness was different. Life was still demanding. Love was still work. But the constant emotional self-monitoring, the fear of wanting too much or asking the wrong thing, had softened. She turned onto her side, facing Evan, and let herself rest in the knowledge that she didn't have to disappear to be loved. Evan stirred slightly, half awake, and squeezed her hand. "Hey," he murmured. "Hey, you okay?" She smiled in the dark. "Yeah, I am." And she meant it. They weren't finished growing. They still had different rhythms, different fears, different ways of processing the world. But they'd learned how to talk about them. And that, more than any promise, felt like something worth holding on to. Maya didn't wake up one morning feeling transformed. There was no sudden sense of arrival, no internal announcement that she had finally figured love out. Growth, she'd learned, didn't work that way. It revealed itself quietly, in moments you almost missed. Like the way she noticed her hands one morning, resting on the kitchen counter as she waited for the kettle to boil, and realized they didn't feel heavy anymore. They weren't energized exactly, just neutral, at ease. The memory surprised her. How clearly she remembered that earlier version of herself, standing in the same spot, months ago, worn down by a tiredness she couldn't quite explain. A tiredness born not of work or responsibility, but of restraint, of holding too much inside. She flexed her fingers now, feeling the warmth return to them as the kettle clicked off. Evan was still asleep in the bedroom, the door slightly ajar. She could hear his breathing, slow and steady. The sound didn't make her anxious, didn't make her wonder what it meant. It simply was. That, she realized, was new. She poured the water, carried her mug to the table, and sat down. The morning light filtered in, soft and forgiving. The city outside was already awake, but inside the apartment, time moved gently. She thought about how different her understanding of love felt now. Before, love had seemed like something you managed, a balance you tried not to upset, a series of careful choices meant to prevent loss. Now, it felt more like a practice, not something you performed perfectly, but something you returned to again and again, with attention and honesty. Evan joined her a few minutes later, hair rumpled, eyes still heavy with sleep. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her for a moment. "You seem peaceful," he said. She smiled. "I feel that way." He nodded, not questioning it. Later that day, Maya met her friend for lunch, the same one who had once asked if ease was really enough. They sat across from each other in a crowded cafe, plates half finished between them. "So," her friend said, smiling, "how are things?" Maya thought about the question before answering. She didn't rush to summarize or soften. "They're good," she said. "Not perfect, but honest." Her friend raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like growth." Maya laughed softly. "It feels like it. She didn't feel the need to defend or explain. The answer stood on its own. Evan noticed the changes in himself too, though he would have struggled to articulate them out loud. He still valued solitude, still needed space to think, but he no longer treated closeness as something that threatened his autonomy. It wasn't a force pulling him away from himself. It was something that existed alongside him. When he needed time alone, he took it without guilt. When he missed Maya, he said so without fear. The balance wasn't always neat, but it was real. One evening, as they walked through the neighborhood, Evan said something that would have been unthinkable to him a year earlier. "I don't feel like I have to brace myself anymore," he admitted. Maya glanced at him. For what? For being misunderstood? For losing myself? She nodded slowly. "I don't feel like I have to shrink anymore either." They kept walking, their steps in sync, the conversation settling into a comfortable silence. Neither of them believed they'd reached the end of anything, but they both understood something important now. Love didn't ask them to become less. It asked them to become clearer, and in that clarity, they had found something steady enough to keep choosing, without fixing, without rescuing, without disappearing. The lesson didn't arrive all at once. It revealed itself slowly, in ordinary moments that didn't feel like conclusions at all. One evening, months later, Maya stood in the doorway of Evan's apartment, watching him search for his keys with unnecessary focus. He was running late, distracted, clearly frustrated with himself. The old version of her might have stepped in, smoothed the moment, reassured him, tried to absorb the tension so it wouldn't linger. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe and waited. "I'm annoyed," Evan said, finally, exhaling. "Not at you, just at everything." "Okay," she replied. "Do you want help or space?" He looked up, surprised by how simple the question felt. "Space. 5 minutes." She nodded. "I'll be here." 5 minutes later, he came back calmer, keys in hand, shoulders relaxed. "Thanks for not fixing that," he said quietly. Maya smiled. "Thanks for telling me what you needed." It was such a small exchange. No drama, no emotional intensity. And yet, it carried everything they had learned. They didn't rescue each other from discomfort anymore. They didn't disappear to avoid it either. They stayed present. That was the pattern. Now, when Maya felt overwhelmed, she named it without apology. When Evan needed distance, he took it without guilt. When fear surfaced, because it still did, they treated it like information, not an emergency. They didn't confuse love with sacrifice. They didn't confuse patience with silence. They didn't confuse closeness with control. One night, sitting together on the couch, Maya said something she hadn't realized she believed until the words left her mouth. "I used to think love was about endurance," she said, "about how much you could tolerate without leaving." Evan nodded slowly. "I used to think love was about independence, about needing nothing from anyone." She looked at him. "Turns out we were both wrong." He smiled. "Turns out Love is about choice. Choice, not obligation, not fear, not guessing. Just two people choosing, again and again, to show up honestly without trying to reshape each other into something safer. They still didn't have everything figured out. There were days when Maya leaned too far into reassurance. Days when Evan pulled back more than he meant to. But now, those moments didn't spiral. They talked. They adjusted. They kept going. A year ago, they spoke every day and avoided the one thing that mattered. Now, they still spoke every day, but they didn't avoid themselves anymore. There was no grand promise at the end of their story, no sweeping declaration about forever. Life was too real for that, and they respected it too much to pretend otherwise. What they had was quieter, healthier. They had learned that love didn't mean fixing someone's wounds or asking someone else to heal yours. It meant recognizing where the wounds were and choosing not to use them as weapons or hiding places. It meant understanding that timing matters, honesty matters, and silence, left unchecked, can teach the wrong lessons. Maya thought back to that first morning, standing at the sink, hands aching with a tiredness she couldn't name. She understood it now. She hadn't been tired because life was too heavy. She'd been tired because she was carrying unspoken hope alone. Now, hope felt shared, not guaranteed, not rushed, just shared. And that made all the difference. They didn't fall in love by fixing each other. They fell in love by staying honest long enough to grow. And for two imperfect people who had once been afraid to name what mattered most, that was more than enough. Some love stories don't end with fireworks. They end with understanding. If this story taught you anything, let it be this. Love isn't about fixing each other. It's about staying honest long enough to grow. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more emotionally real stories with life lessons that stay with you.